Now onto the fabulous Elizabeth Hawes. So Elizabeth Hawes is an American. She's a fashion designer, but she's like so many more things than that. She is really incredible. She's a writer. She is a feminist. She's a labor activist. And throughout her career, she writes a number of different books. Some of them, like It's Still Spinach and Fashion is Spinach, are about fashion, and some of them are about labor politics and about love and all different kinds of things. So she's a really incredible figure, and you can see her there on the left posing in this utilitarian costume that she favored for herself when she was working. These great suspenders, slacks, that was hard to say, suspender slacks, and these simple little flat shoes that she wears. And she's also sitting on a design that is by Le Corbusier and Pierre Gernreich, but also the really fabulous Charlotte Perriand, another female designer that you should know about. And some of you do, who took my History of Modern Design class. So she's one of your options to read for this week. And her writing is really fantastic and breezy and fabulous, and a real scathing critique of fashion as it stood when she entered the industry in the 1920s. She came from an upper middle class family and went to Vassar College. And majored in economics, although she was always interested in fashion and sort of knew by the time she was going to graduate that she wanted to go into fashion. She'd done a little bit of working in New York before she graduated for, I think, Bergdorf Goodman, if I remember correctly. And she ends up moving to Paris after graduation. And she made her living there by posing as an American buyer, going to the designer shows and basically memorizing the fashions that she saw, and then running back to her apartment and sketching them out and selling them. So she was selling copies essentially. And being an American was very advantageous because people would believe that you might be a buyer. So you could get away with this for a good long while. She ended up working for one of these copy houses in Paris that's its whole business was making designer knockoffs through having people like Haws going and observing these shows. And what was unique about that experience was that, unlike the designer houses like, Chanel or Schiaparelli or the other houses at the time, that house was pretty egalitarian because there was no designer at the top of it. There was no Chanel who was sort of dictating to everybody else, and who everybody else sort of had to follow their orders, and who was sort of set apart from the seamstresses and the workers who actually made the garments. Instead, it was much more like a family, and also there was this emphasis about loyalty because they didn't want to get ratted out, right? So Haws really got to understand the whole business from working there, and see all of the different elements of the business of fashion and the production of these garments. The other thing, though, that happened to her there was she got increasingly frustrated with the emphasis on Parisian fashion and why American women were so hell-bent on having fashions from Paris. Why was that Paris label so important? Why was it only Paris that got to say what was fashionable? So when she ended up coming back to the US in 1928, she decided to set up her own shop. So she set up her own custom shop in New York in 1928. And by the early 30s, she was appearing fairly regularly in American fashion magazines, particularly Vogue. And you can see her very modernist ad there at the top. So what's really interesting when you look at the kinds of garments that she was showing in the 30s, you might not guess how radical she actually was when you'll read her writing. So, she's making these very glamorous dresses. A lot of her designs are kind of cheeky, like these lounging pajamas with ponies leaping across them. Very in step with the time in certain ways, but also really very timeless. Haws really focused on making garments that were interesting, simple, and the idea for her was that a garment should last, that it shouldn't be so fixed on a particular trend that you couldn't wear it for several more seasons. And in her writing, she really critiques fashion, particularly because it's always changing, and it doesn't allow for any kind of staying power, and that it, really suggests that women have to be in fashion or they're just sort of hopelessly outmoded. And she totally rejects this idea. This is from It's Still Spinach, which she publishes in 1954. I had better right here differentiate for you between fashion and style. According to Webster, Haws, and Shakespeare, Mr. Webster says fashion is dressing in a way which is favored at the time, while style implies a distinctive manner of dressing adopted by those who have taste. In Fashion is Spinach, I define fashion as a dictator who not only forced people to dress in the way he favored at the time, but also did his best to force perverse changes in women's clothes as rapidly as possible so that American business could sell more things. Fashion, said Shakespeare, is a deformed thief. So here you can see what she's doing, which is saying that fashion is just a way of selling stuff. Fashion is just this part of capitalism that forces people to buy things that they don't need. And what she suggests in its place is style. And if you remember the semester, we started off kind of defining what is fashion and what is style. So it's really fascinating to see a woman who has a fashion business in 1928 write really boldly, even in her first book in 1938, Fashion is Spinach, that, fashion is a dictator and we don't need any more dictators in 1938. That's a really powerful word, by the way, to have used in 1938. So, think about that context. So here you can see some of the simplified designs that Haws was suggesting in the late 1930s. And you can see some of what Elizabeth Hawes says up at the top. She doesn't believe in short evening dresses, willing to endorse ankle-length dresses to make dancing easier. Coats should be complete costume and look as much like a dress as possible. Lines anatomical. Pockets, pockets, pockets. Saves carrying bags and doodads. So this emphasis on practicality, things that make dancing easier, having pockets to stow away things. And you can see there's a pattern at the bottom, which was one that she designed for the Wrigley's Gum Company, so for home sewers to make her garments. She also often came up with cheeky names like Alimony and Misadventure, which are the names of the two parts. I'm not sure which is which for this dress. This is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. Most of the garments, actual garments I'm showing you, are from their collection, and they don't have terribly detailed notes on their digital catalog about them, unfortunately. And I think one thing that makes me a little bit sad from the photographs that they have is they're just on hangers, so we can't really get a great sense of shape, although I think you can a little, and I wanted to show you these just because of the beautiful draping, the way that she's able to put in, marry together these different fabrics and create these kind of belts that are almost built into the garment through the draping and the patterning of the garment itself. But I think the fact that these are all just shown on hangers suggests that these are not garments that have been exhibited much by the museums. And Haws is very much a forgotten designer, which is really too bad because I think her garments themselves are exceptional and stunning. And the way that she works with patterns, she was very influenced by Madeleine Vionnet, who was also a master at draping and working with patterns. But if you look at these looks on the left, the way that she deals with stripes and creates these really exciting shapes through her use of stripes and cutting on the bias, which is something that the Vionnet was also doing. Lots of designers were doing in the 1930s, of course. But she does it in such a striking way and creates these really beautiful garments. And you can see how these kinds of garments would have lasted several seasons. They're not falling into trends. She's using really beautiful saturated colors, but garments that are intended to be long lasting and long wearing. On the left, you can see her. I love this photograph of her like in shorts and a top, working on this model who's in an evening gown. So you can see the kinds of clothes that Haws favored to work in. And these were, in fact, the kinds of clothes that she also made. So on the left, you can see her uphill look from her 1939 to 1940 collection, which is very similar to her suspender slacks that she's wearing in that 1941 picture. And look at this beautiful neck piece, which is worn around the neck of in the black and white photograph, which you can see a lot better in color. So these really interesting, almost architectural accessories. And she was friends with a number of contemporary artists of the period, including people like Alexander Calder and Isamu Noguchi. And I wonder if some of the designs like these aren't maybe inspired by some of their work. So I think there's probably a lot more to uncover there in those connections. By 1940, she ended up with an FBI file. And this was in part because she had the same name as an activist and a union activist who actually advocated for violence, which to my knowledge, Elizabeth Hawes never did. But it did actually mirror some of her left-leaning tendencies. Not that she advocated for violence, but she did start to shift away from making fashion, particularly in the years following the publication of Fashion is Spinach. The title of her book, Fashion is Spinach, comes from this cartoon that ran in the New Yorker in 1928. Where this mother is trying to get her child to eat broccoli. And the child says, I say it's spinach, and I say to hell with it. And so apparently, catching on as things do in the US, this became like shorthand for bullshit. So, and calling anything spinach was kind of calling bullshit, the way we would say it now. So, that now you understand what that title, Fashion is Spinach, means. So it was a really polemic title for a fashion designer to give a book. So she published that in 1938. And as I said, she started to move away from her involvement directly with fashion in that period. And she began to really start writing about fashion even more so after the publication of that book. She had written when she was in Paris. One of the things she did to earn money in addition to making sketches was selling columns about fashion to American newspapers. And so she started working for a number of different publications, including the Detroit Free Press and this short-lived newspaper called PM, where this article, you can see, it's neither abnormal nor new for women to wear trousers, ran in 1940. And she had a weekly column for them and was publishing articles about fashion throughout at least the early 1940s in the magazine, in the newspaper. And you can see these great illustrations that accompanied it. In this article, she is kind of speaking back to critics who were shocked and horrified at her suggestion that by the 1950s, women would have fully embraced wearing trousers. And she argues in this piece, and you'll see her if you choose to read her work this week for your primary source. She argues that women should wear trousers and men should wear skirts, and that they should really just both wear what's appropriate. And it's interesting in this piece because she says, like, of course skirts are more attractive, and for some things they're more easy to move in, so they make a lot of sense. But in other places, especially at the workplace, they might be less useful, less comfortable, less utilitarian. And she talks about, women just want to throw their legs up on their desk like anyone, and they need to wear trousers in order to do that. So you see this great illustration of a woman at a typewriter in this very diaphanous kind of ball gown. And so the suggestion really at the root of all of Hawes's writing is that fashion should really be a matter of personal choice and wearing what you like. And that the problem with fashion as it stands in her time, and I think this is still in many ways true about fashion now, although you all should check me on that and tell me what you think. But that fashion was functioning as this kind of dictator, which told people what to wear, and what was in fashion and what was out of fashion. And so that personal choice and wearing things that that you liked and that were useful and utilitarian for the kinds of work that you did really wasn't available and wasn't the way that most people dressed. So she argues in this article that the fact that more women than ever were working and that they would continue to work in increasing numbers meant that trousers would just quite naturally be adopted because they just made more sense for the workplace. She also argued that clothing should last, as I said. And so this is a piece from 1941 where she's arguing that clothing shouldn't just go out of fashion the next season. It should really be something that lasts, and that women should invest in clothes, and that they should, designers should ensure that those clothes could be worn for at least 4 years, was her proposal. And that she argues that things like sweaters, it's not that women will stop buying clothes, she says. Women will just buy, the same sweater in a different color, the same skirt in new colors, and that will add variety to their wardrobe. What's really interesting about this is that I think in some ways it kind of mimics conversations around sustainability and fashion now. This idea that we want good clothes that are well made, that last, that we're going to consume less. But what's interesting in reading Haws in 1941 is she says women don't have enough money to buy, most women in that time, to buy more than maybe 2 new dresses a year. And so what angers her is that the fashion industry doesn't just recognize this and make things that last so that women can continue to slowly add to her wardrobe. So it's interesting in that the element of waste doesn't really come into this, in part because in the 1940s, clothes were more expensive than they are now. People had, I think, somewhat less disposable income, certainly then. The Depression really doesn't fully end until World War II begins. And also because clothing was generally better made then, and it lasted longer. So it's interesting to see her calling for, what she's really calling for is the style to last longer. So calling designers to make clothes that are that have good style rather than are just fashionable, and asking consumers what they want, which is the other thing which you can see illustrated here, that she wanted sort of disinterested investigators to figure out what consumers want, so that they're not being sold these kind of unnecessary things. The other thing that she takes on in the 1940s is work with a union. She begins to work with the United Auto Workers in the 1940s, specializing in women workers. So during the war, she really almost completely abandons fashion. And part of her UAW work, she ends up taking on a job in the night shift at an aircraft war plant as a way of understanding the kind of work that the women she's representing are doing, and ends up writing some pretty scathing critiques of the way that women workers are being treated in the workplace in this period, and some really interesting feminist writing about the realities of that she experienced as a mother who was working during this period, and the challenges of working a night shift and caring for her son, who you see in this photograph with her that ran in the New York Times. So she's kind of a fascinating figure, very well read and known in the period, and almost forgotten today, which I think is a real shame, because she's so brilliant. And when you read her writing, whether you agree with her or disagree with her, she's a great writer and a really engaging writer. She ends up rebuilding her business a little bit later on in life, which is kind of interesting, because one of the things that she does is just go back to her clients and ask them to go and get the dresses that she's made for them. And she goes to the Brooklyn Museum. This is in 1948 when she reopens her shop. And she says, like, just give me those garments and I'll remake them, because like they've probably worn out by now, but the styles are just as good. So she really was dedicated to that idea of style rather than fashion. So she declared about style that style is, quote, dressing to fit your own self. It lasts. So her idea was that everyone was individual. Everyone would know best how to dress themselves if they really understood themselves. And so for her, dressing was almost this sort of psychological process of getting to know yourself and understanding what you really want. One of the other things that I think is particularly interesting about Haws, which you'll get a little bit when you read her writing, if you choose to read her writing, is that she had essentially the same prescription for men as she had for women. But the argument that she made in the context of men was that they had been told they had to wear these suits, and that suits were uncomfortable, they were hot, they weren't practical for many weather conditions, and that men should really embrace a different kind of dressing. They should move away from their reliance on the suit, and should embrace other ways of being. And you can see some of those in the image that I have here. So she also argues that men should embrace a different way of dressing. And it's really interesting because she describes men as like robots in terms of fashion, and also being just as dictated to by codes around gender and self-presentation as women were. So she really argued that both men and women were restrained by the fashion system, just in different ways. That men were going to have more leisure time, and so they needed to start dressing differently to embrace that leisure. And she really argued that women were being expected to make their bodies beautiful, and that men were expected to just not have bodies, as though they were sort of only useful or only a brain. And she said, we all have bodies. We all want to adorn our bodies. We all want to be comfortable in our bodies. And so that was really her kind of clarion call in her writing around fashion. So I hope those of y'all who elect to read her will enjoy her as much as I do, and know that if you do, there is so much more from her to read. And much of it you can find open source online, which is pretty great. So in the 1960s, 1967, in fact, the FIT Museum held a retrospective which was called Two Modern Artists of Dress, Elizabeth Hawes and Rudi Gernreich. And this is Rudi Gernreich. You already saw him. He had a little cameo in last week's lecture, wearing, as you see him there, his Cardin Cosmo Court suit. And here you can see him on the right with some models in some of his more scandalous styles of the 1960s. He and Elizabeth Hawes became good friends when Haws was living out in California, and knew each other and respected each other's work very much. So it's really fitting that the two were exhibited together. And I think also fitting because both of them had these particular ideas about how fashion might be a part of kind of remaking the world and making a more egalitarian and free society. I think both of them crucially focus on the idea of freedom in terms of their utopian modes of dress. Gernreich, you can see, and you'll see this when you read Haws too, she embrace the freedom of exposing the body and not always covering up the body in his work. He is a really fascinating figure for so many reasons, one among which is that he was the co-founder of the Mattachine Society, which was one of the first organizations activist organizations on behalf of LGBT rights. Harry Hay, who you saw in the excerpts from Before Stonewall that I showed a couple of weeks ago, started the Mattachine Society, and it was in part Gernreich's funding that helped the society start out, although he elected to be a silent partner and to be anonymous because he didn't want his sexuality to be exposed publicly, although those closest to him knew that he was gay. But I think that places him at a really interesting intersection of LGBT rights and this moment in fashion and his calls for making fashion more free. He comes to the US as a refugee from Vienna. And I think the connection with Vienna is really interesting when you look at his designs. And I think if you think back on Floga and the Wiener Werkstätte, I wonder if he wasn't perhaps looking at some of those designs in his work. His mother was a socialist. The family was Jewish. And so they came fleeing the Nazis and the Holocaust, and arrived in the US in 1938 and settled in California. One of the first jobs that Gernreich had, which much is often made of in writing on his work, is that he worked in a morgue washing bodies. And lots of people have argued that that led him to a really intimate understanding, first of all, of anatomy, but also this interest in kind of body conscious fashion. So, you can decide if you think that that's actually a believable conclusion. I think it kind of is, but in any case. So one of his most outrageous garments, which was never really intended to be made at all, was the Monokini. And he created this look in 1964 and didn't really intend to produce it commercially. It was really just a way of forwarding an idea about freedom in terms of dress and suggesting that, men don't cover their tops when they swim. Why should women? And so it was really just a kind of idea. And Diana Vreeland, being Diana Vreeland, the editor of Harper's Bazaar, I think, at the time. I'm probably wrong about that. I'm going to have to check and put up a little box and tell you. But in any case, Diana Vreeland said, you really have to make this thing. You can't just have this as, an idea. And so she insisted that he produced it, and so he did. And it was published in Women's Wear Daily on the model Peggy Moffat, who was his favorite model and muse, who you're going to see in a lot of these photographs on the right-hand side. 3,000 of these garments were reportedly sold. You're seeing an image on the left-hand side from Life magazine of a woman looking horrified at this garment. Although there's only 2 reports of the garment being worn publicly, in one case by a 19-year-old in Chicago who was arrested. So there you go. But I think this kind of emphasizes the sorts of ideas that Gernreich had, which was about freedom and dressing, and embracing the body itself, not treating the body with a sense of shame. Here are a few of his other garments from the early 1960s. You can see that he is expressing that interest in the 1930s that we saw in menswear last week. So that story is also present in women's wear. And you can also see him working with some of these really great kind of pattern on pattern, op art sort of patterns. I think some rhyming maybe with some of the constructivists here too, which is pretty interesting. And we can talk about when we talk together this week. Here you can see him for Montgomery Ward, which I think is pretty amazing, who was producing his space age vinyls. So experimenting with new materials, as we saw some of the designers doing last week. And also making these very kind of futuristic sorts of looks. Here you see Peggy Moffat and you can see why she was a favorite model of his. She really knew how to work his clothes and how to make them exciting. So Gernreich was tapped to create a collection for Expo 70, which was held in Osaka, Japan, one of these world's fairs. And so his collection was meant to sort of predict fashion of the future. And so these are some of the garments that he predicted we would be wearing in the future. So unisex looks, you can see. The idea was that people would shave all of their hair. They could wear wigs if they wanted to, if their heads were cold, or hats. And the idea was to sort of eliminate all of these kind of romantic ideas about fashion and make fashion that was about freedom, and that was practical. He said, fashion will go out of fashion. So I think a lot like Elizabeth Hawes, he really predicted the end of fashion, that it was necessary for fashion itself to end and for something different to replace it. He also, again, was working with new kinds of fabrics here, synthetic textiles. He predicted that we would be ordering clothing from television or catalogs because there would be too much traffic. If you read this one, you're gonna be like, whoa, there are definitely some things he got right. And he argued that nudity would be divorced from sexuality if people really embraced their bodies. Women would wear protective pasties, as you can see in very brief looks like this. And he argued that it was going to be young people who would wear the sort of briefest of looks, and then older people wear caftans that totally cover up their aging bodies that are less exciting to look at. So that was his idea. He said, if a body can no longer be accentuated, it should be abstracted. So the prince would abstract the body. Here you can see some winter looks. So what you would wear when it was colder outside, you could cover up. And some of the interesting wigs that he suggested. And again, the bold cover-ups for the elderly. So this idea of sort of eliminating the embarrassment of old age. And very much like his other work, it was an embrace of youth. And you can see some of the ideas like the bold printed caftan made its way into his other work. So again, you know, I think looking back to somebody like Amélie Floga, I see a lot of resonance here. A more recent example of an attempt to create utopian fashion comes from the Rational Dress Society, this artistic project in which there's an open source pattern for a jumpsuit, which you can go and download right now if you want to and make your own. And the argument that's put forward by the Rational Dress Society is that jumpsuits eliminate choice. You don't have to choose anything. You just have one garment that works for everything. And it eliminates capitalist consumption so that it suits the needs of sustainable fashion, and rejects fashion entirely. They also argue that there are no markers of gender or race with this look. And I think that's one thing I'd love for us to kind of pick up and talk about and think about what where race falls in all of this in terms of these fashions. They also claim that it fits everyone the same regardless of body type. This is something that I don't really buy, but I would love to talk about it with you. But I think it's an interesting suggestion, and it goes back really to the tuta. So the jumpsuit itself, it's kind of working class utilitarian garment, is one that we see coming up over and over again historically. And we can point to a lot of different moments where people have adopted jumpsuits as a signifier for being avant-garde, as a way of embracing this idea of unisex. So the jumpsuits of the punk era we talked about were unisex garments. We can see lots of new wave musicians in the 70s and 80s like Devo or Tina Weymouth adopting this style as a kind of unisex garment. And really it continues to have this life as a kind of avant-garde garment. And I think even more so now, I feel like it's recurring a lot in fashion now, and perhaps it's part of this movement towards clothing that is not necessarily gendered, that is androgynous in certain kinds of ways. So I think that's something interesting, and I would love to talk more about that with y'all this week in discussion. One last designer I want to share with you, and I'm going to link him in through a jumpsuit, is Stephen Burrows. I didn't have a reading from Burrows to offer you, so you would sort of get a sense of his philosophy, but I didn't want to not tell you about him because I think he's fascinating. And again, like Haws and like Gernreich, a designer, an American designer who's not terribly well known, but I think deserves to be much, much better known than he is. Like Gernreich, Haws, like Gernreich and Haws, I think one of the reasons he's not better known is because, you know, his business wasn't long lasting. He has frequently had problems kind of keeping his business going, even more recently. So I think that's one of the reasons that his work doesn't have, or his name doesn't have the kind of recognition that it really deserves. But here you can see a gold lame jumpsuit from the 1970s that he designed, and a very similar one from 1978 worn by a model on the right-hand side. Burrows started working in the late 1960s, and he came from a fashion school, an art school background. He was a student at FIT, and starts out very young, very much like Elizabeth Hawes, who also started out as a designer really very young, and managed to get quite a bit of success quite early on. He opened a boutique called O in 1967, and a few years after that, it was swallowed up into a department store, and he had just like a corner of the department store that was labeled as Stephen Burrows World, where he was selling his fashions. And he won a Coty Award in 1973. So from like starting out in 1967 to winning a Coty Award in 1973, less than 10 years, that's pretty remarkable for a young designer. And you can see some of his designs here, very much a part of the aesthetics of the Peacock Revolution and this late 60s, early 70s moment. But I think he does things very differently than other designers, which is why I sort of saved him for this lecture. Here you can see some of his early designs from around 1970, and you can see them being worn by some models in the photograph below. if you notice a bunch of these shirts that have these patterns on them of two circles and then a kind of oblong shape, those he called his cock and balls shirts. So really embracing sexuality in his fashion, but also embracing the idea of unisex garments, garments that could be interchangeable between women and men. And you can see some examples of those here. On the left-hand side, you can see two models, a female model on the left and a male model in the center wearing very similar peasant look tops. You can see some brightly colored knits modeled by men on Fire Island. And Burrows was a gay man and is, I'm sorry, he's still alive. Burrows is a gay man and was very much part of the gay scene in New York in this period and dressed many others on Fire Island who were a part of this scene. Here on the left, you can see him wearing, alongside a friend of his, Roz Rubinstein, these any-sex tunics, and you can see a bunch of models wearing them on the right-hand side. So his store, O, specialized in unisex designs, and he called them any-sex. And so they were designs often made in colorful knits that could be worn by anyone. And his clients included Jane Fonda, Miles Davis, and Nina Simone. And he would also meet Pat Cleveland at that early boutique, who would become one of his muses, the great model. And here you can see some designs from his boutique, Stephen Burrows World, which you can see the inside of it too was designed to be like this sort of black leather with studs. So this very almost kind of punk look or proto-punk look in the early 1970s. And you can also see on the pants that the male model is wearing on the far right side, another specialty of Burrows, which was leather work. He was really known for leather work, as well as the model in black on the left-hand side. The other thing that Burrows would be well known for is looks that were inspired by dance and movement. And I think that's one of the things that relates him to Rudi Gernreich, this interest in the body and how the body moves in fabric. And these are my photographs from an exhibition at the City Museum of New York several years ago, which was one of the best fashion exhibitions I've seen about Burrows or about anyone really. But what was exciting about this was something about the way that the clothes were displayed and the mannequins, and also the presence of music and footage of these clothes actually walking, I think really gave a sense of the excitement and what was unique about Burrows' work, which was his brilliant capacity for understanding how fabric moved and for using new knit fabrics and synthetics, jersey fabrics like Jasco jersey, mesh fabrics, and understanding how they could work with the body and movement. And in these garments, if you notice the purple and the red dresses at the center there, if you look at the edges, they have this kind of almost scalloped quality. This was one of his trademarks. He loved to have visible seams. He would use red zigzag stitches all over his clothes. And he would also zigzag the edges and pull them as he was doing that. So when he was stitching up jersey, he would serge it. If those of y'all who are sewers who know what a serger is, he would serge the fabric, which just leaves this almost like stitched up but raw seam. And by pulling the jersey fabric as he sewed it, it created this kind of wavy edge, which was called a lettuce edge. And that was really his trademark in design, and created these really light, beautiful, flowing lines in his garments that looked really good when they were dancing in the discos of the 1970s. So I wanted to add Burrows here because I think he adds another element of this embrace of unisex style in this period, and this kind of embrace of a different way of dressing the body that we see emerging in the 1970s. So I'm looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts about this utopian fashion. What looks utopian to you? What would you want to wear in the future? And what do you think are the things that these designers are totally missing? What are the things that they're not talking about that we should be talking about? See you soon. Bye.